What if I told you that the famous log cabin, symbol of the American frontier, was actually an ice trap? The image of a sturdy house providing shelter from the blizzard is only half the truth, concealing a desperate struggle. The real fortress was built not only of logs, but of sweat, ingenuity, and an almost blind faith in tomorrow. Every crack, every stone in the hearth was part of the daily battle against the merciless cold of the Great Plains. Watch the video to the end to find out how simple settlers turned primitive shelters into real bastions of warmth, and which one element of the design was more important than all the logs put together. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival on the frontier, which for some reason is always overlooked. The success or failure of wintering was determined not by an axe or a gun, but by the first decision made long before construction began. I'm talking about choosing a location for a hut. A mistake in this choice made any further efforts meaningless. A settler who built a house on a hill exposed to the winds doomed himself to a painful struggle that could not be won. The first enemy was the wind. On the Great Plains or in mountain valleys, the winter wind was not just a nuisance, it was a physical force that sucked the heat out of the walls. Therefore, the wise settler sought natural shelter. The ideal location was a low-lying area or hillside sheltered from the prevailing north and west winds. Placing a hut at the foot of a slope or in a small hollow could raise the internal temperature by a few critical degrees. The next factor was water. A source of clean water was vital, but its location required compromise. Too close to a river meant the risk of spring flooding and more humid, damp air. Too far away meant exhausting trips with buckets through snowdrifts in the middle of a blizzard. The ideal was a spring or stream on a slope, located upstream from where the house was being built, but close enough for daily access. The sun was the third ally. In the northern hemisphere, the southern slope received maximum sunlight during the short winter days. A hut with its main facade and, if available, windows facing south passively absorbed every ray of heat. This not only warmed the dwelling a little, but also had enormous psychological significance, providing light during the dark months. North-facing slopes, plunged into perpetual shadow, were ice traps. Drainage was an invisible but critical factor. The site had to dry out well. A hut built in a low-lying area with poor drainage would turn into an island in the middle of a swamp in the spring. Moisture penetrated the earthen floor, causing the lower logs to rot and creating an unhealthy, damp atmosphere. Choosing a location on a small hill with sandy or rocky soil prevented these problems. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. Which of these factors do you think was most critical for survival? Protection from the wind or access to water? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next studies.
Where do we even begin? There's no wood for miles.
We'll use the sod cutter. It's the only way we'll build anything out here.
Are you ready to learn the truth about what the first houses on the frontier were actually built from? Contrary to the popular image of log cabins, many of the first settlers on the Great Plains simply did not have access to wood. Their first and only building material was the earth beneath their feet. This led to the emergence of two unique types of dwellings: dugouts and sod houses, or soddies. A dugout was the fastest and most primitive shelter. A settler who arrived at his plot in late autumn did not have time for full-fledged construction. He chose a hillside or the bank of a ravine and literally dug into it. A room of the required size was dug out, and the open side was closed with a wall made of any available material, often the same layers of turf. Such dwellings had their advantages. The main one was geothermal stability. Being underground, the dugout was protected from the freezing wind, and the temperature inside rarely dropped much below freezing, even without a fire. It was damp, dark, and cramped, but it was still a shelter. The roof of a dugout usually consisted of poles covered with branches, grass, and then a thick layer of turf to provide waterproofing. Of course, waterproofing is too strong a word. Such roofs often leak during rain or spring snowmelt. A more advanced and permanent option was a soddy or turf house. On the plains where there were no trees, thick grass grew with an incredibly dense and strong root system. These roots held the soil together like rebar. Settlers used a special plow to cut this turf into long strips, similar to bricks. These sawed bricks were laid in layers, like ordinary masonry, with the grass facing down. The walls were incredibly thick, up to 1 meter wide. This thickness made them almost impervious to wind and cold. In summer, such a house was cool, and in winter, it retained heat relatively well. But how could earthen walls, constantly cold and damp, become a fortress against the frost? The secret was not in the logs themselves, but in what the settlers used to seal the gaps between them. In the next chapter, we will reveal the truth about chink, a process that was more important than the construction itself. The hidden truth that everyone is silent about is that the famous log cabin is a myth. More precisely, its idealized image is a myth. We imagine neatly fitted, smooth logs creating an impenetrable wall. The reality was quite different. The walls were full of gaps, and it was the fight against these gaps that determined whether the house would be warm. It was impossible to build a hut from perfectly even, identical logs. The settlers used whatever wood was at hand, crooked, knotty trunks of various diameters. Even with the most careful stacking with locks at the corners, there were huge gaps between the logs. The winter wind penetrated through these gaps, negating all efforts to heat the house. That is why the most important process was not the construction of the walls itself, but what followed it, chinkering. This word can be translated as filling. First, pieces of wood, chips, stones, or even moss twisted into bundles were stuffed into the large gaps between the logs. This was a rough filling that created the basis for the next layer. This next layer was called daubing. It was an improvised mortar, the composition of which depended on local materials. Most often, it was a mixture of clay, sand, and water. Sometimes dry grass or straw was added to it for reinforcement, so that the mortar would not crack when it dried. Applying this mixture was dirty and laborious work. It was literally pressed into the cracks with the hands, trying to fill all the voids. This work had to be done in relatively warm and dry weather so that the clay could dry and harden. If frost hit while the clay was still wet, it would simply freeze and fall off. This dirty, endless work was the true price of warmth. Like this if you didn't know about this critically important but forgotten technology. What if I told you that the walls were the easiest part of the construction? The real engineering challenge for the settler was the roof. The fifth wall of the hut had to withstand the weight of snow, keep out water, and retain the precious heat rising from the hearth. Mistakes in roof construction were fatal. The earliest and most common type was a turf roof, similar to those made on soddies. First, rafters were laid, strong poles running from the ridge to the walls. Thinner slats were laid across them. This frame was covered with a layer of bark, grass, or reeds to create a waterproof layer. On top of this, thick layers of turf were laid, often in 2 layers, with the grass facing downwards so that the roots would intertwine and create a dense covering. This turf, as in the case of soddy, was heavy but had good insulating properties. However, it had the same disadvantages. It absorbed water, leaked, and could collapse under its own weight. In the spring, such a roof could grow grass, which on the one hand looked picturesque, but on the other hand allowed roots and moisture to penetrate inside. A more advanced and durable option was a roof made of wooden shingles or shakes. These were thin boards that settlers cut by hand from suitable logs, usually cedar, oak, or pine. This process was incredibly labor-intensive and required not only time, but also a large amount of high-quality wood. Each plank was laid overlapping, like scales, so that water would roll off without getting inside. Such a roof was much lighter than a turf roof and provided much better protection against leaks. A shingle roof was also preferable in terms of fire safety compared to a thatched or turf roof. Although wood also burns, tightly laid shingles, especially in a humid climate, were less susceptible to accidental sparks from the chimney. The angle of the roof was critically important, especially in northern regions where there was a lot of snowfall. Roofs were made steeper, with a slope of at least 30 degrees. This allowed the snow to slide off under its own weight, rather than accumulate and threaten to collapse the entire structure. The weight of wet snow was a constant threat to any roof, especially primitive structures. An incorrectly calculated frame could simply not withstand the multi-ton load after a heavy snowstorm. Settlers were often forced to go outside and clear the snow with long poles, which was no easy task in the freezing cold. Thatched roofs were particularly vulnerable. They absorbed meltwater, became even heavier, and could collapse suddenly. The transition to shingles was not a matter of aesthetics, but of long-term safety. The space under the roof rarely remained empty in a typical frontier cabin. In most one-room buildings, a half-story attic or loft was built. It served as a universal storage space for supplies, tools, dried herbs, and items that did not fit downstairs. In larger families, sleeping quarters were often set up in this loft. People usually climbed up there using a simple ladder or brackets hammered into the wall. We are, of course, talking about the hearth, the heart of any hut. How difficult was it to build a reliable chimney from materials at hand? In the next chapter, you will learn how settlers created the heart of their home and why it was often the most dangerous part of the entire structure. If the hut was a fortress, then the hearth was its heart, the vital center around which all life revolved. It was the only source of heat, the place for cooking, and often the only source of light on long winter evenings. Its construction was a priority, and the survival of the family depended directly on its quality. Functionality was valued much more highly than aesthetics, and mistakes in construction could be fatal. In the earliest stages, in temporary shelters or trapper huts, the hearth could be extremely primitive. Sometimes it was just a fire lit on the earthen floor in the center of the room. In this case, the smoke escaped through a special hole in the roof. This design, borrowed from indigenous peoples, was simple, but it made the room incredibly smoky and was extremely inefficient in terms of heat utilization. It quickly became clear that the hearth needed to be placed against a wall. This saved space and allowed for the construction of a chimney for more efficient smoke removal. Usually, one of the end walls of the hut, the shorter one, was chosen for the fireplace. This allowed the chimney to be built outside without taking up precious interior space and slightly reducing the risk of fire for the other logs. Stone was the ideal material for building a hearth and chimney. If a settler was lucky enough to have rock outcrops or a riverbed with large boulders nearby, he would try to use them. Collecting and transporting these stones was extremely hard work. They were laid on top of each other and held together with a makeshift mortar of clay, sand, and water, creating a massive and fireproof structure. However, stone was not available everywhere, especially on the Great Plains. Much more common, but also more dangerous, was the adobe chimney. Its construction was an example of desperate ingenuity. First, a frame for the future pipe, similar to a woven basket, was knocked together from strong sticks or poles. This frame formed a hollow shaft. Then this woven frame, known as a wattle, was coated with a thick layer of clay mixed with grass or straw for reinforcement. The clay was applied in several layers, carefully packed into all the cracks. The inner surface of the pipe had to be as smooth as possible so that less soot would settle on it. This design was lightweight and did not require rare materials. What if I told you that the settler's main enemy was not lurking outside, but had already made its way inside? Even the strongest hut with a warm hearth was a battlefield. It was a war against invisible but ruthless enemies, drafts, dampness, and cold spots. Defeating them required no less ingenuity than building walls. The main enemy was the draft. It was caused by temperature differences. The huge hearth drew air out of the room, and in its place, icy outside air was sucked in through myriad cracks in the walls, doors, and windows. This constant flow of cold air moved across the floor, cooling the feet and making it unbearable to stay in the hut, despite the roaring flames. The floor was the second problem. In most of the first huts, it was earthen. Even if it was carefully tamped down and sometimes sprinkled with sand, it remained cold and damp. The cold from the frozen ground rose directly into the room. Any spilled water turned it into a dirty mess. Only over time could settlers afford the luxury of plank flooring. Any available means were used to combat the cold floor. If possible, skins were thrown on the floor, but this was not available to everyone. More often, homemade woven mats made of reeds or corn cobs were used. In some houses, the floor was covered with dry grass or straw, which had to be changed regularly as it quickly absorbed moisture and dirt. Dampness was the third enemy. It came from everywhere. From the earthen floor, from the leaky roof, from the clay plaster on the walls. The damp air was not just unpleasant, it made the cold more piercing. In such an atmosphere, everything quickly became damp. Clothes, bedding, food supplies. This created ideal conditions for mold. Lighting was another challenge. Windows, if there were any, presented a dilemma. Glass was incredibly rare and cost a fortune. Most often, window openings were covered with oiled paper or thin, scraped horn plates. They let in very little light, but they did a good job of letting heat escape. The battle against these invisible enemies was daily and exhausting. Can you imagine what it's like to constantly feel an icy draft, even when sitting a few steps away from a roaring fire? But the house was only half the battle. In the next chapter, you will learn how the settlers obtained the most important resource, without which all these efforts would have been in vain: fuel. The heart of the fortress was the hearth, but this hearth was an insatiable beast that demanded constant payment. Fuel was the true currency of winter, and its supply was the main measure of a settler's security. The fire in the hearth must never go out, day or night. If it went out, the cold instantly penetrated the house, the water in the buckets froze, and reigniting the damp wood became a torment. Maintaining the fire was a round-the-clock watch. To heat even a small hut in the harsh winter, a colossal amount of firewood was required, almost unimaginable for us today. We are not talking about a few logs, but tens of cubic meters of wood. Preparing this supply was not just an autumn task, but a labor that often took all summer and autumn. The work was done by hand, with an axe and, if you were lucky, a two-handed saw. Each tree had to be felled, cut into logs and split into logs. The key concept was seasoned wood. Freshly cut, or green, wood contains a lot of moisture. When burned, it hisses and smokes more than it gives off heat. In order for the wood to burn hot and clean, it had to be dried. The ideal settler prepared wood a year in advance. Wood chopped, that spring was stacked in a wood pile and dried all summer to be ready for the following winter. The wood pile itself was an important strategic object. Its location was an art. It had to be close enough to the house so that the wood could be carried in during a snowstorm, but not too close to reduce the risk of fire and attract pests to the walls. The wood was stacked in a special way, with gaps to allow air to circulate and continue drying the wood, and was often covered with bark or boards to protect it from rain and snow. The process of gathering firewood was fraught with danger. Felling trees by hand is one of the most risky occupations. An incorrect cut, a sudden gust of wind, or a dry branch falling from the top could result in serious injury. And in frontier conditions, far from any medical help, a broken leg or a deep cut from an axe often meant a very bad outcome. But what if there were no trees? For settlers on the Great Plains in the world of sod houses, this was a pressing question. Wood was a luxury, brought from far away and costing a fortune. They had to rely on what was literally under their feet. First, they used any shrubs and dried sunflower stalks. The hut was a fortress, not only for people, but also for their vital supplies. All the crops harvested during the short summer and all the meat obtained in the fall had to survive the winter. Here the settlers had a double problem. They had to protect their food not only from rotting, but also from freezing. A sack of potatoes frozen to death was as useless as one that had rotted. The ideal solution was a cellar or crawl space. In many huts, a pit was dug directly under the floor during construction. Sometimes it was lined with stone or wood, but more often it was just an earthen cellar. A hatch in the floor led down to it. Using the same geothermal principle as in a dugout, such a cellar maintained a stable cool but above freezing temperature, even when it was bitterly cold outside. The main treasures were stored in this subfloor. Root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, carrots, rutabagas, were the basis of the winter diet. They were not simply piled up in a heap. To prevent rotting and sprouting, they were sprinkled with dry sand or straw. Each vegetable was isolated from its neighbors, which prevented rot from spreading. Barrels of salted cabbage and pickled apples were also stored here. Meat required other methods. Hunting in the fall was critically important. The meat obtained had to be preserved for all the long months. The most reliable method was salting. The meat was cut into pieces and thickly sprinkled with salt in wooden barrels. Salt was an expensive but vital commodity. Another method was smoking. Pieces of meat were hung for weeks in the smoke of a special smokehouse, which not only preserved them, but also added flavor. Drying was another proven method. Fruits, berries, and vegetables were cut into thin slices and laid out in the sun at the end of summer. Mushrooms and herbs were strung on threads and hung under the roof. This was a simple and effective way to preserve vitamins. Grains such as corn or wheat were stored in sacks or boxes in the driest place in the hut, often in the attic. Winter on the frontier was not just a time of cold, but a time of true siege. Once deep snow fell, the cabin became an isolated island in the middle of a boundless white ocean. For the settlers, this meant months spent in a confined space, in a constant struggle not only with the cold, but also with darkness, boredom, and psychological pressure. Contrary to the idea of hibernation, life inside the hut did not come to a standstill. It simply shifted its focus. All the energy that had been spent working in the fields during the summer was now directed towards sustaining life inside. The day was strictly structured by routine. These daily repetitive tasks were not just a necessity, they were an anchor that kept the mind from despair. The day began before dawn with the most important task, blowing on the coals in the hearth to rekindle the fire. Then the endless chores began. Cooking over an open fire was a long process. Baking bread, cooking soup from dried meat and root vegetables, constantly heating water. All this required constant attention. Winter was a time for repairs. The men had their own set of responsibilities. They spent long hours by the fire, putting in order the equipment that would be needed in the spring. They repaired broken tool handles, carved new tines for wooden rakes, wove ropes, and repaired horse tack. Every nail and every board was counted. The women had their own endless cycle of work. Winter was the time for processing textiles. They carded and spun wool, weaving coarse cloth on primitive looms. Darning and mending clothes was a daily necessity. Clothes, subjected to harsh conditions, wore out quickly. Nothing was thrown away. Old clothes were cut into strips for blankets or rags. Lighting was a luxury. The short winter days provided only a few hours of dim light, which penetrated through a single window or oiled paper. As soon as dusk fell, the hut was plunged into semi-darkness. The only sources of light were the glow from the hearth, and if you were very lucky, a homemade candle made from animal fat or a simple oil lamp. When we look at a log cabin, we must understand that we are not just looking at a structure, we are seeing a battlefield. This fortress against the cold was not a static object, but a living, breathing organism that required constant attention. It was a symbol not so much of protection as of an endless struggle in which man pitted his will against the chaos of the elements. Every element of daily life that we discussed was not just a technical solution, it was an act of faith. The settler did not just patch up cracks in the walls, he asserted his right to be there. He did not just chop wood, he invested his labor in the future, in tomorrow, which might not come. It was a bet on survival, made against all odds. It is important to understand that the hut did not defeat the cold. It only allowed them to survive alongside it. The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the frost on the walls in the morning, in the icy draft near the floor, in the frozen water in the bucket. The hut was not an impregnable citadel, but rather a besieged outpost where the battle was fought for every degree of warmth, for every sip of water. This daily, exhausting struggle shaped a special character. It weeded out those who were not prepared to pay the daily price. It did not require heroism on the battlefield, but quiet, stubborn courage in the face of routine. The ability to wake up in the icy darkness and start the cycle again. To light a fire, fetch water, feed the family. That was the real
small
feat.
Task.
We see that every cabin on the American frontier was not just a home, but a complex, multi-layered system of survival. It was a fortress built against a ruthless enemy, and that fortress required daily, relentless defense. From the choice of location to the last moss-covered groove, everything was subordinated to one goal: to retain heat and preserve life. Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research about how life on the frontier of civilization was really built.